Chapter 24, Monopoly. Okay, in this chapter, we're going to identify situations that can give rise to monopoly, describe the demand and marginal revenue conditions a monopolist faces, discuss how a monopolist determines how much output to produce, what price to charge, and the amount of its profits, understand price discrimination, and explain the social cost of monopolies. All right, so what is a monopolist? A monopolist is simply when there is one producer of a good or service in an industry. They have all of the demand curve, and they are the only provider of the good or service. Examples of monopolies are lots in the pharmaceutical industry because of patents. Standard Oil that John Rockefeller made his fortune in was a monopoly. Ma Bell, the telephone company created by Alexander Graham Bell, was a monopoly that was broken up later in the late 1970s, early 1980s into South Central Bell, AT&T, and Sprint. How does a firm obtain monopoly power? Basically, there are barriers to entry to the industry. So basically, it's difficult and has a very large startup cost, or there's some kind of legal restriction that prevents firms from entering the market. There could be economies of scale or legal or governmental restrictions. We see this particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, where a company will spend 10 years, they'll issue stock and spend 10 years trying to get a pharmaceutical on the market. And then if it's approved by the FDA, they will get a patent, and they will have the exclusive right to sell it for the next 20 years. Other examples are economies of scale, low unit cost, and prices drive out rivals. The largest firm can produce at the lowest average total cost. Examples where there are natural monopolies or natural economies of scale would be municipal water supplies, the cable company, or electricity providers. A natural monopoly is a monopoly that arises from the peculiar production characteristics in an industry. It usually arises when there are large economies of scale, and one firm can produce at a lower average cost and can be achieved by multiple firms. So if you think about the water company, it wouldn't make much sense to have competing water companies with competing water pipes running to everybody's property. It would be way too expensive and take up way too much space. So in that case, a natural monopoly exists. The cost curves that might lead to a natural monopoly, you can see a downward sloping long-run average cost curve and a downward sloping long-run marginal cost curve. Other examples, licenses, franchises, and certificates of convenience. Examples, electric utilities, radio and television broadcasting. Radio and television broadcasting, there aren't true monopolies. They're more like an oligopoly. If you don't have cable television or internet, then you're stuck with network television, in which there are just very few providers of the service. Other examples, legal or governmental restrictions, patents, regulation, and tariffs. Patents, when you invent something, you're granted a patent on it, which gives you the right to sell it for 20 years. Lots of examples in the pharmaceutical industry where there's companies where their sole product is one drug. And if it's approved, they gain a patent for it, and they'll often produce it or sell it to a larger company. Government regulation, for example, Amtrak is a monopoly on legal travel by train in the United States. And then, of course, tariffs on imported goods. The monopolist faces the industry demand curve because the monopolist is the entire industry. Recall that under perfect competition, if a firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve, it is a price taker. The forces of supply and demand establish the price per unit. Marginal revenue, average revenue, and price are all the same, and that is not the case with a monopoly. Remember that marginal revenue equals the change in total revenue due to a 1 unit change in the quantity produced and sold. So with the perfect competition, the perfect competitor can sell all that they want at one price. With a monopoly, If a monopolist sells more, it lowers the price in the market because they face a downward sloping demand curve and thus have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. All right, in order to increase output, the monopolist has to lower the price on the last unit sold. So an example of perfect competition versus a monopoly, the demand curve for the perfectly competitor was horizontal or perfectly elastic, whereas monopolist, it's downward sloping. Okay, so here you have a chart of the differences between a monopoly and a perfect competition, and I'll give you a minute to review this chart. Monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve, its average revenue curve. This means it cannot charge just any price with no changes in quantity, because depending on the price charged, a different quantity will be demanded. And so here you can see as we move down the demand curve, we have to give up revenue from the lower price, but we gain revenue from an increase in quantity. And again, where the monopolist will produce is where the marginal revenue curve intersects the marginal cost curve. That is always the profit maximizing condition in any industry, is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. All right, a monopolist is a single seller of a well-defined good or service with no close substitutes. There could be some imperfect substitutes. The demand curve slopes downward because individuals compare marginal satisfaction to cost. The market demand curve, which the monopolist alone faces in this situation, slopes downward because individuals compare the marginal satisfaction they will receive to the cost of the commodity to be purchased. Again, as any firm, profit maximization is the goal. All right, the perfect competitor has only to decide the profit maximizing output. For the pure monopolist, we must seek a profit maximizing price output combination. The monopolist is a price searcher. Price searcher is a firm that must determine the price output combination that maximizes profit because it faces a downward sloping demand curve. We can determine the profit maximizing price output combination with either of two equivalent approaches by looking at total revenues and total cost, or by looking at marginal revenues and marginal costs. With total revenues, total cost approach, we try to maximize the difference between the two. With the marginal revenue, marginal cost approach, we set the two equal to each other. So again, why do we set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost? If you remember from the previous lecture, I showed you the calculus that goes into why we set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And here on this chart, I'll give you a minute to review it. You can see the profit maximizing output combination is between 9 and 10 units. Particularly at 9 units is where we have the maximum profit. You can see that marginal cost is not quite equal to marginal revenue, but going up to 10 units, it's not equal either. And at that point, marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue. So in this case, it's between 9 and 10 units. Okay, so for the total cost approach, if you see here where my cursor is, if you can see that, I don't know if you can see that. If you look at the graph on the left, we're going to maximize the difference between total cost and total revenue, which is where the slopes are the same, which is what the calculus does, is it tells us where the slopes are the same. On the right-hand graph, you can see it's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we go up to the demand curve to determine the price in the market. Are producing past where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The result is the incremental revenue will exceed the incremental cost. Producing less than where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The monopolist is not maximizing profits that way either. They can gain additional revenue lower than the cost it takes to produce it when marginal revenue is less than marginal cost. Okay, so here we can see we have marginal revenue equal to marginal cost at QM. And to determine the price in the market, we go up to the demand curve, and that determines the price in the market. All right, the monopolist profit is the shaded area. And so again, we charge a price where marginal revenue equals marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is the quantity QM between 9 and 10 units. And the monopolist profit is the green shaded area. Do monopolies always make profits? The answer is not always. A good example of this is municipal water supplies. There are lots of stories out there where municipal water companies have gotten into trouble where they just can't make a profit. And it depends on whether the average total cost is everywhere above average revenue or demand. No price output combination allows the monopolist to recoup its cost. And so here you can see, even though they're charging the profit maximizing price at QM and have the profit maximizing quantity, average total cost is above the demand curve, and so they incur losses. One solution to this problem is to charge the average total cost in the market to just recoup their cost from supplying the good. This is how lots of electric utilities are regulated. They're allowed to charge the average total cost of producing electricity plus some return to capital for their shareholders. And the same thing with municipal water supplies. All right, let's move on and talk about price discrimination and selling a profit at price. Selling a given product at more than one price with the difference being unrelated to differences in marginal cost. For example, student discounts. Student discounts are a classic example of price discrimination. Other examples are discounts for the elderly. This is different than price differentiation, which is establishing different prices for similar products to reflect differences in marginal cost and providing these commodities to different groups of buyers. Necessary conditions for price discrimination. The firm must face a downward sloping demand curve. The firm must be able to readily identify and cheaply identify buyers or groups of buyers with predictably different elasticities of demand. And they must be able to prevent the resale of the product or service. For example, at McDonald's, they offer an elderly individual discount. Elderly individuals can't purchase food and then turn around and sell it to others in line using their discount. And so McDonald's can very quickly and easily identify elderly individuals and grant them a discount for price discrimination. Comparing monopoly with perfect competition, let's assume a monopolist comes in and buys up every single perfect competitor. Notice the monopolist produces a similar quantity and sells at a higher price. Why are monopolies inefficient? Consumers pay higher price and some of the surplus that the consumer previously received, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, is given to the monopolist. And the monopolist also produces a lower quantity, making them inefficient. So here we have an example of perfect competition on the left and the monopolist on the right. And you can see the monopolist produces at a lower quantity and charges a higher price. So what is consumer surplus? It's the difference between the demand curve and the price of the product. And so the perfectly competitive firm price is equal to marginal cost, which is equal to average total cost, which is the most efficient production quantity for society. And generally, government regulatory agencies try to promote competition. Deadweight loss is the portion that no one in society is able to obtain in the situation of a monopoly. I'll show you a chart in a minute with deadweight loss. As a result of monopoly, consumers are worse off in two ways. The monopoly profits that result constitute a transfer of a portion of consumer surplus from consumers to the monopolist. The failure of the monopoly to produce as many units as would have been produced in a perfect competition eliminates consumer surplus that otherwise would have been a benefit to consumers. And so here you have a deadweight loss associated with monopoly production. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture.